Sarah Thompson's heart pounded as the Sentinel Technologies vehicle crashed through the security barrier, speeding toward the excavation site. In the chaos, she made a split-second decision, grabbing her grandmother's decryption key and classified journals. She caught Colonel Reynolds' eye. "This way," she whispered urgently, slipping away from the farmhouse toward the forest. Decades ago, Eleanor Thompson had prepared for exactly this moment, when powerful forces would come hunting for technology that could change modern warfare forever. As military security engaged the corporate intruders, Sarah led the colonel through dense undergrowth toward a hidden cave only a Thompson would know. Inside the secret sanctuary lay the final piece of her grandmother's brilliant safeguard, a mathematical trap ensuring that technology without ethics would destroy itself. The race was on to protect a 70-year-old secret that remained dangerously relevant in today's world. If this remarkable story of buried secrets and forgotten heroes intrigues you, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more extraordinary historical discoveries. Hit that like button and notification bell so you never miss the truth that lies just beneath the surface. The morning sun cast long shadows across Oak Ridge Farm as Sarah Thompson guided her bulldozer through the dense eastern forest. Each fallen oak revealed decades of Montana history, in its rings a record of droughts, fires, and harsh winters that had shaped this land. At 28, Sarah hadn't expected to be here, clearing trees on the family property she'd once been so eager to escape. The irony wasn't lost on her after earning an environmental science degree and building a promising career in Seattle. She'd returned to the very soil she'd spent years trying to leave behind. "Dad always said this eastern section was sacred ground," she muttered, wiping sweat from her brow as she maneuvered around a particularly massive oak. But he never explained why. Oak Ridge Farm stretched across 200 acres of rolling Montana countryside, its weathered red barn and fields of wheat, barley, and alfalfa, representing 4 generations of Thompson family heritage. Sarah had inherited it all following her father's unexpected death last winter. The crops, the equipment, the mortgage, and the responsibility for keeping the family legacy alive in an era when small farms were vanishing into corporate agriculture. The transition from environmental consultant at a prestigious Pacific Northwest firm to full-time farmer hadn't been easy. Sarah approached agriculture with the analytical mindset that had made her successful in her previous career, searching for ways to make the struggling operation profitable again. With commodity prices falling and property taxes rising, the farm's finances were precarious at best. "The eastern forest has to go," she decided after reviewing the books for the 3rd time that month. 40 acres of potential cropland just sitting there doing nothing. Her father, like her grandmother Eleanor before him, had always insisted the eastern forest remain untouched. "That land stays as it is," he'd declare whenever Sarah questioned the decision during her visits home. "Your grandmother's wishes, some things are better left undisturbed." But sentiment couldn't pay the bills. The bank had made it clear either increase production or prepare to sell. So here she was, clearing the land her family had protected for generations, feeling like a traitor with every tree that fell. The bulldozer blade struck something with a jarring metallic clang, nearly throwing Sarah from her seat. The resistance was nothing like a root system or boulder. This was manufactured, human-made. "What the hell?" she muttered, backing the machine away. Years of environmental site assessments had taught her caution around unexpected objects. Old farms often contained forgotten equipment, underground storage tanks, even unmarked family cemeteries. Climbing down from the cab, Sarah grabbed a shovel from her truck and began carefully clearing soil around the obstruction. As she dug, her confusion deepened. The object was aluminum, curved in a way that reminded her of no way. She whispered as more emerged from the dirt. "That can't be." 3 hours of careful excavation revealed what was unmistakably an aircraft wing, its once gleaming surface now corroded and covered in decades of soil and decaying vegetation. As Sarah continued to clear away the earth, more of the aircraft emerged: a bent propeller, the remains of an engine block, and finally the partially crushed fuselage bearing faded U.S. military markings. "A World War II fighter plane," she said aloud, though there was no one to hear her. Her grandfather James had served in Europe during the war, But he'd been Army infantry, not Air Force. There were no military airfields within hundreds of miles of Oak Ridge Farm. How had a warplane ended up buried on Thompson land? The fading light warned of approaching dusk as Sarah made her most startling discovery. Carefully clearing debris from what remained of the cockpit area, she found a metal case fused to the aircraft's frame. Unlike the surrounding metal, this case appeared to be made of a different alloy that had better resisted corrosion. It was secured with a complex locking mechanism and bore official military markings, along with a name stenciled on the side that made her pulse quicken. CPTE Thompson. Eleanor Thompson, Sarah whispered. Grandma. Eleanor Thompson had passed when Sarah was 12, leaving behind a legacy as the backbone of Oak Ridge Farm. Family lore painted her as a determined woman who had kept everything running while Grandpa James served in Europe during World War II. When he returned, they'd worked side by side until his death in 1972, after which she'd run everything herself until Sarah's father took over in the 1990s. But Eleanor had been a farmer, not a military captain. She'd never mentioned any involvement with aircraft or classified materials. Her wartime role, as understood by the family, had been limited to managing the farm and participating in local agricultural support efforts. Night had fallen by the time Sarah completed her initial documentation of the site. Using her phone, she photographed every aspect of the aircraft in the mysterious case, careful not to disturb anything further. A lifetime of respecting proper procedures, first instilled by her grandmother and reinforced through her environmental science training, led her to contact the county sheriff's office rather than attempting to open the case herself. "I've found what appears to be a World War II military aircraft buried on my property," she reported, trying to keep her voice steady. With what looks like classified material still inside, the dispatcher took down the information efficiently. "We'll notify the appropriate federal authorities. Miss Thompson, please don't disturb the site further until officials arrive." "Of course," Sarah agreed. When should I expect someone? Hard to say with these things. Could be days. Sarah spent a restless night researching World War II aircraft and military operations in Montana. Finding nothing in the historical record about training flights or crashes in Madison County, the mystery deepened when she reviewed her grandmother's journals. Noticing for the first time a conspicuous gap in the entries between April 1944 and December 1944, precisely during the period when Allied forces were making critical advances in Europe. "I always assumed she was just too busy with harvest to write," Sarah mused, running her fingers over the leather-bound volumes. But now I wonder if there was another explanation for her silence. Dawn broke over Oak Ridge Farm with an unusual disturbance. Sarah, who had finally fallen asleep in the early morning hours, was awakened by the sound of vehicles approaching on the rarely used East Access Road. Looking out her bedroom window, she saw a convoy of unmarked black SUVs and military-style trucks making their way toward the crash site she had discovered the previous day, hastily pulling on work clothes. Sarah rushed outside to intercept the unexpected visitors. By the time she reached the eastern field, a dozen individuals in specialized gear were already establishing a perimeter around the partially excavated aircraft. Their uniforms bore no standard military branch insignia, but their organized efficiency clearly indicated professional training. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, approaching what appeared to be the team leader. "This is private property. I'm Sarah Thompson, the owner." A tall man with close-cropped silver hair turned to face her. "Colonel William Reynolds, Defense WWII Accounting Agency." He introduced himself, extending a government identification card. "We're responding to your report about a discovered military aircraft. I need to ask you some questions about this site. Miss Thompson?" Sarah was taken aback by the speed and scale of the response. "I only called the sheriff last night. How did you mobilize a team this quickly?" Colonel Reynolds' expression remained neutral. "Certain keywords in your report triggered immediate notification protocols. World War II aircraft with potential classified materials falls under our jurisdiction for recovery and identification." As they spoke, more vehicles arrived, including specialized equipment trucks containing what appeared to be ground-penetrating radar and advanced scanning technology. A separate team began unloading preservation materials designed for recovering fragile historical artifacts. I understand you discovered a secured case with military markings. Colonel Reynolds continued. Can you show me exactly where it's located? Sarah led the colonel to the partially exposed cockpit area, pointing out the metal case still fused to the aircraft's frame. It has my grandmother's name on it, Eleanor Thompson. She ran this farm during the war, while my grandfather served in Europe. At the mention of the name, Colonel Reynolds exchanged a significant glance with one of his colleagues. Eleanor Thompson, he repeated carefully. You're certain that's the name on the case? Positive E. Thompson with a captain's designation, which makes no sense. My grandmother was a civilian farmer, not military personnel. Colonel Reynolds consulted a tablet one of his team members handed him, scrolling through information not visible to Sarah. Mrs. Thompson, I believe there's more to your grandmother's history than your family may have been aware of. This aircraft and its contents are connected to a classified operation from 1944 codenamed Project Aurora. The revelation sent a jolt through Sarah. My grandmother was involved in a classified military project. That's impossible. She never left Montana during the war. That's the official record, Colonel Reynolds agreed. But Project Aurora involves civilian specialists with specific skill sets who operated under military authority while maintaining their cover identities, based on our preliminary assessment. Your grandmother may have been one of those specialists. As they spoke, a technician approached with scanning equipment, having completed an initial assessment of the metal case. Sir, preliminary readings indicate the case integrity is intact. Contents appear to be preserved despite the age and crash conditions. We're detecting unusual material composition consistent with the Aurora specifications. Colonel Reynolds nodded. Establish a Level 3 containment protocol and prepare for controlled extraction. Turning back to Sarah, whose confusion was evident, Colonel Reynolds adopted a more sympathetic tone. Ms. Thompson, I understand this is unexpected and concerning. I'm authorized to share certain historical information with you, given your familial connection to this operation. But I need to establish a secure debriefing environment first. Sarah stood her ground, crossing her arms. This is my property, and apparently my grandmother's legacy, whatever you're planning to do here. I deserve to know why military personnel are suddenly swarming my farm over a 70-year-old crash. Colonel Reynolds considered this for a moment, then nodded. You're right. Please join me in our mobile command center. What I'm about to tell you is still classified, but given your direct connection and the circumstances, you've been granted provisional clearance. As they walked toward one of the larger vehicles, Sarah noticed the team working on the aircraft had uncovered more of the fuselage, revealing a compartment behind the cockpit that appeared to have been modified from the standard design. That's not standard for a P-47 Thunderbolt, she observed, her research from the previous night allowing her to recognize the anomaly. No, Colonel Reynolds confirmed. This aircraft was specially modified for Project Aurora. Only 12 were converted, and until today, we believed all were accounted for. Finding the missing 13th aircraft is historically significant in itself, but if the case contains what we suspect, this discovery has implications beyond historical documentation. Inside the mobile command center, screens displayed real-time data from the scanning equipment surrounding the crash site. Maps of the property overlaid with geological surveys and historical aerial photographs covered one wall, while another showed what appeared to be personnel files from the 1940s. Colonel Reynolds gestured for Sarah to sit at a small conference table, then activated a security protocol that created a sound-dampening field around them. What I'm about to share with you would normally require extensive background checks and security clearances, given the circumstances and your grandmother's involvement. We're expediting the process. Sarah leaned forward, her scientific curiosity overcoming her initial alarm. What exactly was Project Aurora, and how was my grandmother involved? Colonel Reynolds pulled up a historical file on a secure tablet. In 1943, as the war in Europe intensified, the Allies became aware that Germany was developing advanced guidance systems for their weapons. The ability to precisely target military installations from great distances would have given them a significant advantage. The United States initiated a counter-program to develop our own guidance technology, but also to create countermeasures against the German systems. The colonel swiped to display technical schematics that, even to Sarah's untrained eye, appeared remarkably sophisticated for 1940s technology. Project Aurora recruited civilians with specialized knowledge physicists, engineers, and importantly, individuals with a rare aptitude for calculating complex navigational coordinates. Your grandmother, according to these records, possessed an exceptional mathematical ability that made her valuable to the project. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. My grandmother was good with numbers. Sure, she kept immaculate farm records, but some kind of mathematical genius. That's not part of any family story I've ever heard. Many of the civilian specialists were chosen precisely because they appeared ordinary. Colonel Reynolds explained, Eleanor Thompson maintained her cover as a farmer while periodically receiving specialized training and conducting calculations crucial to the project. Her work was disguised as agricultural planning meetings and Women's Land Army coordination. The researcher pulled up a black and white photograph showing a group of people in civilian clothes standing before a chalkboard filled with complex equations. In the corner, partially obscured but unmistakable, stood a younger version of the woman from Sarah's family photographs, Eleanor Thompson. This is from a training session in 1943, Colonel Reynolds explained. Your grandmother was part of a network of civilian mathematicians whose calculations were essential to the development of early electronic navigation systems. These systems eventually evolved into what we now know as GPS technology. Sarah stared at the image, trying to reconcile this revelation with the grandmother she had known, a practical farmer with calloused hands and a no-nonsense approach to life. Why keep this secret for so long? The war ended over 70 years ago. Project Aurora achieved breakthroughs that remained classified well into the Cold War, Colonel Reynolds explained. Additionally, the civilian specialists were given permanent cover identities to protect them from potential Soviet interest in their expertise. Your grandmother's contribution to military technology advancement was significant enough that maintaining her cover was considered a matter of national security. Sarah processed this information slowly, pieces of her family history rearranging themselves in light of these revelations. And the aircraft, the case with her name, how does that fit into this story? Colonel Reynolds's expression grew more serious. In late 1944, as Allied forces pushed toward Germany, 13 modified P-47s were dispatched carrying prototype navigation devices developed through Project Aurora. 12 reached their destinations in England, where the technology was implemented in bombing operations that significantly increased precision and reduced civilian casualties. The 13th aircraft, the one on your property, disappeared during a snowstorm while returning from a Canadian testing facility. The colonel pulled up a historical weather map showing a massive winter storm system covering the northern United States in December 1944. The pilot reported engine trouble near the Montana border, then all contact was lost, despite extensive searches. No trace of the aircraft or its cargo was ever found until now. Sarah's mind was racing. So this plane crashed on our farm during a snowstorm in 1944. But that doesn't explain why it was buried so thoroughly, or why my grandmother's name is on a classified case inside it. That, Colonel Reynolds said gravely, is what makes this discovery particularly sensitive, according to the original mission parameters. Your grandmother wasn't supposed to be involved in the transport phase of the project. Her name on that case suggests she may have either created the contents or was intended to receive them, neither of which aligns with the official record. Outside the command center, the recovery operation had intensified. Additional personnel had arrived, including what appeared to be historical preservation experts in specialized security teams. The crash site now resembled an archaeological dig, with carefully measured grids and preservation materials protecting the exposed aircraft components. Colonel Reynolds checked an incoming message on his tablet, then turned back to Sarah. The extraction team is ready to remove the case. Given your family connection, would you like to be present when we open it? Sarah didn't hesitate. Absolutely. If this involves my grandmother, I want to see everything. As they exited the command center, Sarah noticed that the team had fully exposed the aircraft's identification numbers. A technician was photographing them carefully while consulting historical records. We've confirmed the aircraft's identity, the technician reported. "This is definitely the missing P-47 from the Aurora Squadron. Tail number 224897. Pilot was Lieutenant Richard Hayes, listed as missing in action since December 11, 1944. Colonel Reynolds nodded solemnly. "Have the recovery team check for human remains. Lieutenant Hayes's family deserves closure after all these years." Sarah followed Colonel Reynolds to a specialized tent that had been erected over the cockpit area. Inside, a team wearing preservation gloves had carefully separated the metal case from the aircraft frame and placed it on a stabilized work surface. Advanced scanning equipment surrounded the case, generating three-dimensional images of its contents without opening it. "The locking mechanism is intact but degraded," explained a technician monitoring the scans. "We should be able to open it using the original access protocols without damaging the contents." Colonel Reynolds turned to Sarah. "This case contains technology that was cutting edge in 1944. Even with decades of advancement since then, the principles developed in Project Aurora remain foundational to modern navigation systems. What your grandmother contributed to helped shape the modern world in ways that remained hidden from public knowledge." The technician carefully entered a sequence into the lock mechanism, referencing historical documents for the correct combination. With a faint click that echoed through the silent tent, the case unsealed for the first time in over 70 years. As the lid was carefully raised, Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding with anticipation. Inside lay not one but two items, a device approximately the size of a small typewriter, its metal casing etched with serial numbers and technical specifications, and a leather-bound journal with E. Thompson embossed on its cover. The prototype navigation calculator. Colonel Reynolds identified the device with evident reverence. One of only 13 created, and the only one with the original calibration algorithms intact. This is an extraordinary historical find. But Sarah's attention was fixed on the journal, a direct link to the grandmother she thought she had known, but who had apparently harbored secrets beyond anything she could have imagined. "May I?" she asked. Reaching toward the journal, Colonel Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. "Normally, all materials would be quarantined for preservation assessment, but given the circumstances," he added, handing Sarah a pair of archival gloves, "please use these." With trembling hands, Sarah carefully opened the journal to its first page. There, in the familiar, neat handwriting she recognized from the farm ledgers, was an inscription, "For my granddaughter. Should this ever reach her, some secrets are buried not to hide shame, but to protect what matters most. The work documented here helped end a war, but the knowledge within could start another. Guard it wisely, as I have guarded you. Eleanor Thompson, Captain, Project Aurora." Sarah looked up at Colonel Reynolds, her eyes wide with the implications of what she had just read. "This was meant for me. Somehow. My grandmother knew this would be found someday." Colonel Reynolds studied the journal with newfound interest. "This suggests Eleanor Thompson anticipated the aircraft's discovery eventually. But how would she have known where it crashed if the official record showed no trace was ever found?" The answer struck Sarah with sudden clarity. "Because she's the one who buried it. The eastern forest was always off limits when I was growing up. Dad said it was because the soil was poor and the trees were needed as a windbreak, but Grandma was the one who insisted it remain untouched. She must have known exactly what lay beneath those oaks." As this realization settled, a technician approached with an urgent update. "Colonel Reynolds, we've completed the preliminary ground scan of the surrounding area. There appears to be a small underground structure approximately 50 meters east of the crash site. Dimensions and construction suggest a bunker or storage facility, likely dating to the same period as the aircraft." Colonel Reynolds turned to Sarah, whose expression reflected the same startled recognition. "Did you know about any bunker or underground structure on your property?" Sarah shook her head. "No, but—" She paused, remembering something. "There's a small shed in that area that's always been kept locked. The key was passed down from my grandmother to my father, and then to me when I inherited the farm. Dad called it Eleanor's workshop, but said it hadn't been used in decades." Colonel Reynolds immediately mobilized a team to investigate the shed and potential underground structure. As they made their way through the partially cleared forest, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Her quiet, practical grandmother, the woman who had taught her to respect the land and question conventional thinking, had apparently led a double life as a military mathematician, working on classified technology that helped shape the course of World War II. The small wooden shed looked unremarkable from the outside. Weathered by decades of Montana seasons, but still structurally sound, Sarah produced a tarnished brass key from her pocket, hesitating only briefly before inserting it into the padlock that had secured the door for as long as she could remember. "My father made me promise never to lose this key," she explained as the lock opened with surprising ease, as if it had been regularly maintained despite its aged appearance. "He said it was important to our family history, but never explained why." As the door swung open, revealing not the expected tool storage but a small, meticulously organized office space that appeared frozen in time, Sarah realized she was about to discover exactly what her grandmother had meant when she used to say, "Sometimes what's buried needs air." The room contained a desk with a mechanical calculator, filing cabinets with combination locks, and walls covered in maps of Europe marked with coordinates and flight paths. In the center of the floor was a trapdoor, its existence hidden by a woven rug that had been carefully positioned to conceal it while appearing decorative. "This was her real workshop," Sarah whispered, taking in the hidden command center her grandmother had maintained in plain sight on their family farm. Not for agriculture, for warfare. Colonel Reynolds studied the maps with professional interest. "Your grandmother wasn't just a mathematician, Miss Thompson. Based on these materials, Eleanor Thompson was coordinating multiple aspects of Project Aurora from this location. This goes well beyond the role described in our historical records." As specialized teams documented the workshop's contents, Sarah carefully lifted the concealed trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Emergency lights quickly illuminated what lay below a fully equipped underground bunker containing communication equipment, technical manuals, and most significantly, a complete duplicate of the navigation device found in the crashed aircraft. A backup, Colonel Reynolds realized, examining the preserved technology. She maintained a complete secondary system in case the transported prototypes were lost or captured. Sarah moved through the underground space in a state of wonder, seeing her family legacy transformed before her eyes. On a small desk in the corner sat a framed photograph she had never seen before. Her grandmother in a military uniform standing proudly beside the same P-47 aircraft now being excavated from the eastern field. "She wasn't just a civilian consultant," Sarah said, picking up the photograph. "She was fully integrated into the military operation." Colonel Reynolds nodded solemnly. "Eleanor Thompson appears to have been one of the most significant unacknowledged contributors to Allied victory. The navigation system she helped develop reduced bombing error rates by over 60% in the final months of the war, saving countless lives on both sides by allowing for precision targeting of military installations rather than carpet bombing." As Sarah continued exploring the bunker, she discovered something that finally explained the deliberate burial of the aircraft. In a locked cabinet, carefully preserved, were detailed reports of German efforts to capture Project Aurora technology and the civilian specialists who developed it. One document, marked Most Secret, detailed the discovery and execution of two Project Aurora mathematicians in occupied France in early 1944. She buried the plane to protect herself and the technology, Sarah realized. If it had been discovered, it would have revealed her connection to the project and potentially made her a target. Colonel Reynolds reviewed the documents with grave interest. "According to these records, your grandmother received intelligence that German agents had identified several Aurora specialists operating in the United States. The crash may have been an opportunity to conceal both the technology and her involvement by creating a missing aircraft scenario." The implications were staggering. Eleanor Thompson, while maintaining her cover as a Montana farmer, had been engaged in high-level military intelligence work, making calculations that guided bombing runs, developing navigation technology that would influence decades of future innovation, and protecting classified information that could have changed the course of the war if it had fallen into enemy hands. As the day progressed and the full extent of the discovery became apparent, more specialized teams arrived at Oak Ridge Farm. Historical preservation experts cataloged every item in the workshop and bunker, while military historians eagerly studied the maps and technical documents that filled in crucial gaps in their understanding of wartime navigation development. For Sarah, each new revelation transformed her understanding of her family heritage. The farm she had inherited wasn't merely agricultural land passed through generations. It was the carefully maintained cover for operations that had helped shape modern history. Your grandmother's contributions remain classified because they continued to influence military technology well into the Cold War. Colonel Reynolds explained as they reviewed Eleanor's technical journals together. The principles she developed for calculating precise coordinates under varying atmospheric conditions became foundational to satellite navigation systems developed decades later. The journal Sarah had found in the metal case proved especially revealing. Beyond technical calculations and project notes, Eleanor had included personal reflections that showed the weight of her dual responsibilities maintaining the farm that supported the local wartime economy, while secretly performing work that directly influenced military operations overseas. I calculate coordinates by day that guide bombs to their targets. Eleanor had written in one entry from 1944, "By night, I pray for the men who fly the missions, including those whose faces I'll never know. The fields I tend feed a nation at war. While my equations help ensure those sacrifices won't be in vain, few will ever know the true crop harvested from this Montana soil, not food, but the mathematics of victory." As evening approached, Sarah sat on her farmhouse porch, watching the continued activity around the crash site and workshop. The woman she had known as her practical, no-nonsense grandmother had been revealed as something far more complex, a mathematical prodigy who had used her exceptional abilities to serve her country while maintaining the family farm and protecting her community from the knowledge of the dangerous work concealed beneath its peaceful surface. Colonel Reynolds joined her, holding a formal document. "Miss Thompson, I've received authorization to share something with you. Your grandmother was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal in a classified ceremony in 1985. Your father was briefed on a limited basis about her service, though the full extent of her contributions remained restricted information." "Dad knew?" Sarah asked, surprised. "He never said anything." "According to our records, he honored her wish to maintain the family's public identity as farmers rather than drawing attention to her classified work. The workshop was to be preserved, but not accessed unless circumstances demanded it. Your father was entrusted with maintaining this secrecy until such time as the information could be safely revealed." Sarah considered this, remembering her father's insistence on leaving the eastern forest undisturbed and his careful maintenance of the locked workshop. He was protecting her legacy, just as she protected the country. Colonel Reynolds nodded. "And now that legacy passes to you, along with decisions about how it should be preserved going forward." As night fell over Oak Ridge Farm, Sarah Thompson found herself at a crossroads similar to ones her grandmother must have faced decades earlier, balancing the responsibilities of maintaining the family farm with newly discovered obligations to history and national security. The cleared trees that had led to this extraordinary discovery had literally unearthed not just a missing wartime aircraft, but a profound family legacy of service, sacrifice, and quiet heroism. "My grandmother always said that farming teaches you to look beyond the surface," Sarah reflected, watching as lights illuminated the continuing work at the crash site. "I never realized just how deeply that philosophy ran in our family." The crashed P-47 and its classified cargo had remained buried for over 70 years, protected by oak trees and family silence. Now exposed to the light of a new century, Eleanor Thompson's extraordinary contributions would finally receive the recognition they deserved. While her granddaughter began to understand that the true inheritance of Oak Ridge Farm extended far beyond its fertile soil and weathered buildings to encompass a legacy of courage, intelligence, and unwavering dedication to principles that transcended the boundaries of her Montana fields. As morning light filtered through the remaining oaks surrounding Oak Ridge Farm, Sarah Thompson stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the methodical activity around the crash site. The initial shock of yesterday's discoveries had given way to a profound curiosity about her grandmother's secret life. Military personnel continued their careful excavation of the P-47 Thunderbolt, while another team cataloged the contents of Eleanor's hidden workshop and underground bunker. Colonel Reynolds approached the farmhouse, his crisp demeanor softened slightly by the events of the previous day. Sarah met him on the porch, offering a fresh cup of coffee, which the colonel gratefully accepted. "We've made significant progress overnight," Colonel Reynolds reported. "The navigation device is even more sophisticated than our historical records suggested. Your grandmother's mathematical innovations were at least a decade ahead of their time." Sarah gestured toward the eastern field. "Have you found any trace of the pilot, Lieutenant Hayes?" Colonel Reynolds nodded solemnly. "Human remains were recovered from the cockpit area. DNA testing will confirm, but personal effects suggest it is indeed Richard Hayes. His family has been notified that we may have finally located him after all these years." The weight of this human cost settled over Sarah. Beyond the technological discoveries and family revelations lay the stark reality of a young pilot who never returned home, whose fate had been concealed on her family's land for decades. "There's something else you should see," Colonel Reynolds said, extending a weathered leather wallet. "This was found in a sealed compartment of the aircraft. The preservation is remarkable." Sarah carefully opened the wallet to find military identification for Lieutenant Richard Hayes, alongside a faded photograph of a young woman standing before a farmhouse, unmistakably her grandmother. "Eleanor." "They knew each other," Sarah whispered, studying the image. On the back was handwritten, "Eleanor, my guiding star, forever. Richard." Colonel Reynolds watched Sarah's reaction carefully. "We've been reviewing your grandmother's journals from the workshop. It appears Eleanor and Lieutenant Hayes worked closely together on Project Aurora. Their relationship seems to have extended beyond professional collaboration." This unexpected connection sent Sarah back to her grandmother's journals with fresh perspective. Returning to the farmhouse study, she carefully examined Eleanor's agricultural records from 1944, noting now the subtle patterns that had been invisible before weather observations that tracked perfect flying conditions. Notations about radio signals, disguised as comments about farm equipment, and most tellingly, entries about Richard visiting for equipment consultations. She documented everything in plain sight, Sarah marveled. Hidden within ordinary farm records? A technician arrived with newly processed photographs from the bunker's archives, revealing Eleanor in military settings alongside scientists and officers in several images. Lieutenant Richard Hayes appeared at her side, their professional demeanor betrayed by the subtle ways they stood together, slightly closer than protocol would dictate. "We've confirmed something remarkable," Colonel Reynolds explained, joining Sarah in the study. "According to declassified records, Lieutenant Hayes wasn't just a pilot. He had a mathematics background from Princeton and was selected specifically to test the navigation systems your grandmother helped develop. They were intellectual counterparts." This revelation transformed Sarah's understanding of the crashed aircraft. It wasn't merely a military transport that happened to fall on Thompson land. It represented a direct connection between her grandmother and the young pilot who carried her mathematical innovations into the war. Hayes was flying Eleanor's prototype directly to her, Colonel Reynolds continued. The mission logs indicate he diverted from his assigned route, possibly to deliver the device personally rather than through official channels. The snowstorm provided cover for this unauthorized detour. As excavation continued throughout the morning, Sarah immersed herself in her grandmother's technical journals discovered in the underground bunker. Despite her environmental science background, much of the advanced mathematics exceeded her understanding, but Eleanor's meticulous documentation revealed a brilliant mind working at the boundaries of 1940s technological capability. She developed an algorithm for calculating precise positions using radio triangulation, Sarah explained to Colonel Reynolds, pointing to pages of complex equations. There are references to something called atmospheric compensation factors that apparently allowed for more accurate readings under variable weather conditions. Colonel Reynolds nodded appreciatively. Those principles became foundational to modern GPS technology decades later. Your grandmother's work essentially anticipated satellite navigation systems before satellites existed. By midday, a senior military officer arrived at Oak Ridge Farm, General Marcus Sullivan, whose insignia and bearing commanded immediate respect from the assembled teams. His arrival signaled the escalating significance of the discovery. "Monsieur Thompson," he greeted Sarah formally, "the implications of what you've uncovered extend beyond historical interest. The technological principles documented in your grandmother's work remain relevant to current defense systems. I've been authorized to brief you on certain classified aspects of Project Aurora that help explain why this discovery is generating such attention." In the privacy of the mobile command center, General Sullivan activated enhanced security protocols before continuing. Project Aurora wasn't merely about navigation, he explained. It was part of a broader initiative to develop what we now call smart weapons ordnance that could be directed with unprecedented precision. The mathematical principles your grandmother developed allowed for real-time course corrections that revolutionized aerial warfare. He displayed archival footage showing test bombing runs from 1944, comparing standard missions with those using the Aurora guidance systems. The difference was dramatic, conventional bombing scattered widely across target areas, while Aurora-guided weapons struck with remarkable precision. By the final months of the war, these systems had reduced civilian casualties by an estimated 60%, while increasing military target accuracy by over 70%. The general continued, "Your grandmother's algorithms quite literally changed the moral calculus of warfare, making it possible to disable enemy capabilities with minimal collateral damage." Sarah absorbed this information with growing awareness of her grandmother's ethical legacy. Eleanor hadn't just been a mathematician serving the war effort. She had fundamentally shaped how technology could make warfare more humane, even while making it more effective. The navigation device in that aircraft isn't just a historical artifact. General Sullivan concluded, "It contains the original algorithmic architecture that has influenced every precision guidance system developed since, in the wrong hands. It could still compromise certain aspects of current military technology." As the general spoke, a commotion outside drew their attention. A convoy of unmarked vehicles approached along the main road to Oak Ridge Farm, not military or government vehicles, but expensive black SUVs with tinted windows and corporate license plates. "Sentinel Technologies," a security officer reported, checking the approaching vehicles through binoculars. 3 vehicles, approximately 8 individuals. General Sullivan's expression hardened. "How did they know about this operation already?" "We've maintained strict information security." Sarah remembered something. "Yesterday, before I reported the crash, I took photos on my phone. They were automatically backed up to my cloud storage." She pulled up her account on a tablet, checking the access logs. "Someone accessed these images remotely last night from an IP address I don't recognize." The general immediately ordered enhanced security around the perimeter, while instructing his communications team to trace the unauthorized access. Sentinel Technologies specializes in reverse engineering historical military technology for modern applications, he explained to Sarah. "They've been particularly interested in Project Aurora for years." As security personnel moved to intercept the approaching vehicles at the property line, Colonel Reynolds pulled Sarah aside. "There's something you need to see immediately. We found it in a hidden compartment in your grandmother's desk in the farmhouse study." Colonel Reynolds carefully unfolded a sealed letter that had been preserved in a waterproof container. The envelope was addressed simply, "For my granddaughter, when the past returns," with trembling hands. Sarah opened the letter, recognizing her grandmother's distinctive handwriting. "My dearest granddaughter, if you're reading this, then what lies buried has finally surfaced. The work I participated in during the war carried both promise and peril, the promise of saving lives through precision, and the peril of what such technology might become in the wrong hands. Richard Hayes was more than my colleague. He was the love I never spoke of, who carried my work across dangerous skies. When his aircraft disappeared in the storm, I made the painful decision to protect both the technology and our family by concealing the truth. The official record shows a missing plane that never reached me. The reality lies buried on our land. What you must understand now is that certain organizations have never stopped searching for the original Aurora algorithms. I encoded safeguards into my work mathematical keys, without which the technology cannot be fully implemented. These safeguards were my insurance against its misuse. Trust Colonel William Reynolds. He was my student decades ago, though he may not reveal this connection immediately. The continuation of Project Aurora has remained in the hands of those who understand its ethical implications. The final key is hidden where only a Thompson would think to look beneath the roots of what sustains us, with love and faith in your judgment. Eleanor Thompson. Sarah looked up at Colonel Reynolds with newfound understanding. You knew my grandmother personally? Colonel Reynolds nodded, dropping his official detachment. Eleanor was my doctoral advisor in applied mathematics at MIT in the 1980s. Few knew of her academic work she published under a pseudonym while maintaining her identity as a Montana farmer. When this discovery was reported, I requested the assignment specifically because I recognized the location. Outside, the standoff at the property line continued. General Sullivan was firmly refusing access to the Sentinel Technologies representatives, who were presenting what appeared to be legal documents claiming rights to inspect any recovered World War II technology based on patents they had acquired. The roots of what sustains us, Sarah repeated, considering her grandmother's clue. Moving with sudden purpose, Sarah led Colonel Reynolds to the farmhouse kitchen to the ancient cast-iron stove that had heated the home for generations. Grandmother always said the stove was the heart of the farm, what sustained us through every winter since 1928. Kneeling beside the stove, Sarah carefully examined its base, finding a small, almost invisible seam in the brickwork of the hearth. Pressing firmly on what appeared to be a solid brick revealed a hidden compartment containing a small metal box. Inside lay a mechanical device unlike anything Sarah had seen before, a brass and copper mechanism with interlocking gears and a numeric keypad, clearly designed by the same hand that had created the navigation calculator found in the aircraft. The decryption key, Colonel Reynolds breathed, examining the device with reverent care. This is the safeguard Eleanor mentioned, the mathematical key needed to fully implement the Aurora algorithms. General Sullivan joined them, his attention immediately focused on the device. This changes everything. Without this key, the navigation device is incomplete, its most advanced functions impossible to reverse engineer. The general's radio crackled with an urgent update. Sir, Sentinel Technologies representatives are presenting a court order signed by Judge William Hargrove demanding access to inspect any recovered World War II artifacts under the Historical Preservation Act. Judge Hargrove, Sarah repeated. Recognition dawning. He's on the board of directors for Madison County Historical Society. I attended their fundraiser last month and mentioned my plans to clear the eastern forest. General Sullivan's expression darkened. Information leaked from civilian channels. Then, they've been monitoring you, waiting for something to surface. Sarah felt a chill at the realization that her innocent comments at a local event had triggered corporate surveillance. What do they want with 70-year-old technology? Surely modern systems are far more advanced. Modern systems evolved from your grandmother's work, Colonel Reynolds explained, but they incorporate computational inefficiencies, necessary compromises made because no one fully understood her original algorithms. This device contains the pure, elegant mathematics as Eleanor conceived it, potentially allowing for guidance systems far more precise than anything currently deployed. The ethical implications were immediate and concerning. Such technology could advance peaceful applications like autonomous vehicles in disaster response systems, but could equally enable weapons with unprecedented precision and destructive capability. We need to secure both devices immediately, General Sullivan decided. Thompson, as the legal property owner and Eleanor's heir, your cooperation would simplify matters considerably. Sarah considered her grandmother's letter the hidden workshop where Eleanor had balanced mathematical brilliance with ethical foresight, and the approaching corporate representatives whose interests seemed primarily commercial rather than historical. I'll cooperate on one condition, Sarah stated firmly. My grandmother's work needs to be protected not just from misuse, but for its historical and scientific significance. I want her full contribution acknowledged and preserved." Before the general could respond, a commotion erupted at the property line. Despite security measures, one of the Sentinel Technologies vehicles had forced its way through, speeding toward the crash site with urgent purpose. "Secure the devices," General Sullivan ordered as security personnel moved to intercept the approaching vehicle. In the ensuing chaos, Sarah made a split-second decision. Taking both the decryption key and her grandmother's journals, she slipped away from the farmhouse toward the dense forest at the western edge of the property, an area she knew intimately from childhood explorations. "This way," she called to Colonel Reynolds, who hesitated only briefly before following. "There's somewhere my grandmother showed me somewhere. Only a Thompson would know to look." As security forces contained the Sentinel Technologies intrusion, Sarah led Colonel Reynolds along a nearly invisible path through dense undergrowth. After several minutes of difficult hiking, they reached a natural rock formation that appeared unremarkable except to someone who knew its secret. "Grandmother called this the counting stones," Sarah explained, carefully shifting a specific rock that revealed a narrow opening. "She taught me how to measure angles between certain stones to locate this entrance. I always thought it was just a game." The narrow passage opened into a small cave with a flat, dry floor. Battery-powered LED lights activated automatically as they entered, revealing a space that had been prepared decades earlier as a secure fallback position complete with preserved supplies, communication equipment, and a reinforced safe. She prepared for exactly this scenario, Colonel Reynolds realized, examining the cave's contents. Eleanor anticipated that someday someone would come looking for her work. Sarah carefully placed the decryption key and journals in the safe, whose combination she knew instinctively. The geographic coordinates of Oak Ridge Farm translated into a numeric sequence. "We should return before they notice we're missing," Colonel Reynolds suggested. "The general is trustworthy, but in this situation, keeping Eleanor's safeguards separated from the navigation device is precisely what your grandmother intended." When they emerged from the forest, the situation at Oak Ridge Farm had stabilized. Military police had detained the Sentinel Technologies representatives who had breached the property line, while General Sullivan was engaged in tense negotiation with the company's legal team. "Their court order is technically valid," he explained when Sarah and Colonel Reynolds rejoined him, giving no indication he had noticed their brief absence. "But we're asserting national security precedents. This will eventually reach higher courts. But for now, we maintain control of the site and all recovered materials." Throughout the afternoon, as legal arguments continued at the property boundary, the technical teams completed their recovery of the aircraft and its contents. The remains of Lieutenant Richard Hayes were respectfully transferred to a specialized transport for proper identification and eventual return to his family. In a quiet moment, Sarah stood beside the excavated crash site, now just an empty depression in the earth where secrets had lain buried for decades. She thought about the young pilot who had diverted from his mission to deliver her grandmother's work personally, a decision that cost him his life, but potentially kept the technology from falling into the wrong hands. "Lieutenant Hayes' sacrifice wasn't in vain," General Sullivan said, joining her at the site. "Our preliminary assessment of the aircraft suggests it was damaged before the crash, possibly by enemy action. He managed to reach your grandmother's property before going down, which can't have been coincidence. He was trying to bring it home to her," Sarah realized, "not to a military installation or research facility, but to Eleanor personally." As evening approached, the Sentinel Technologies representatives finally departed under military escort, their court order temporarily superseded by national security directives. Their departure marked only the beginning of what would clearly become a complex legal battle over the rights to Eleanor Thompson's technological legacy. In the farmhouse kitchen, Sarah hosted an impromptu gathering of the senior project personnel, General Sullivan, Colonel Reynolds, and key members of the recovery team. The informal setting seemed appropriate for discussing Eleanor Thompson's work, surrounded by the everyday farm environment she had maintained as her cover. "Your grandmother's contribution to navigation technology saved countless lives during the war," General Sullivan acknowledged, raising a toast with the coffee Sarah had prepared. "But her ethical foresight in creating mathematical safeguards may prove equally important to history." Eleanor understood something essential that many scientists miss. Colonel Reynolds added his perspective, that technological advancement without ethical constraints can lead to unintended consequences. Her deliberate limitation of her own work shows remarkable wisdom. As the officials discussed the immediate security measures needed to protect both the recovered technology and Oak Ridge Farm itself, Sarah felt a growing clarity about her own role in this unfolding story. She was not merely the accidental discoverer of historical artifacts or the inheritor of family property. She was the continuation of a legacy of responsibility that Eleanor had carefully prepared her for, even from beyond the grave. "General," Sarah said, interrupting the technical discussion with newfound confidence, "I believe I understand what my grandmother intended. She didn't want her work destroyed or permanently hidden. She wanted it preserved but protected from misuse. The decryption key ensures that the technology can only be implemented with deliberate ethical consideration." The general studied her thoughtfully. "And what would you suggest happens now?" "Ms. Thompson, a partnership," Sarah proposed. "My grandmother's work should be studied and acknowledged publicly. Her mathematical brilliance deserving full recognition after decades of secrecy. But the complete implementation of her algorithms should require multiple authorizations, creating a system of checks and balances that prevents unilateral deployment." Colonel Reynolds smiled with evident approval. "That approach honors both Eleanor's scientific contribution and her ethical concerns. It's exactly what she would have wanted." As night fell over Oak Ridge Farm, temporary security lights illuminated the property, while military personnel established a protective perimeter that would remain in place during the ongoing investigation. Sarah stood on the farmhouse porch, watching the stars emerge above the oak forest that had kept her family's secrets for so long. Colonel Reynolds joined her, offering a document he had prepared. "I've drafted an initial proposal for the Eleanor Thompson Historical Technology Trust, a framework that would protect your grandmother's intellectual property while allowing for its studied application under ethical guidelines." Sarah reviewed the document, recognizing that it represented a path forward that balanced historical acknowledgement, scientific advancement, and ethical safeguards. "This feels right," she said simply, honoring both her genius and her foresight. Inside the farmhouse, on the kitchen table where generations of Thompsons had shared meals and made decisions that shaped their family's course, lay Eleanor's journals and technical documentation, a legacy finally emerging from shadow into light. Beside them, Sarah had placed the photograph of her grandmother with Lieutenant Richard Hayes, acknowledging the personal connection that had intertwined with history. "Tomorrow we'll begin the formal process of documenting everything for proper historical preservation," Colonel Reynolds explained. "Eleanor Thompson will finally receive the recognition she deserves in the scientific and military historical record." General Sullivan, preparing to depart for Washington with the secured navigation device, offered his final thoughts. "Your grandmother understood something essential about powerful technology, that how we choose to use our knowledge matters as much as the knowledge itself. That ethical perspective is perhaps her greatest legacy." As the military convoy prepared to depart, carrying the carefully preserved artifacts of Project Aurora, an elderly gentleman arrived at Oak Ridge Farm, introducing himself as Thomas Hayes, the 75-year-old son of Lieutenant Richard Hayes. He had traveled from Chicago after receiving the notification about his father's remains. "I never knew him," Thomas explained as Sarah welcomed him into the farmhouse. "He was reported missing before I was born. My mother never remarried, always believing somehow he might return." Sarah showed him the photograph found in his father's wallet, Eleanor and Richard standing together at Oak Ridge Farm. "They were colleagues," she explained gently, "and perhaps more than that." Thomas studied the image with emotion. "All my life, I've wondered who he really was, what kind of man my father had been. This is the first new piece of him I've discovered in decades." As Sarah prepared guest accommodations for Thomas Hayes, she realized that her impulsive decision to clear the eastern forest, a choice driven by financial necessity, had inadvertently fulfilled Eleanor's long-term plan. Her grandmother had buried the aircraft knowing that someday it would be discovered, but only when the world was ready for the truths it contained. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," Thomas observed, looking through Eleanor's journals that Sarah had carefully selected to share. My father must have recognized that in her. Perhaps that's why he diverted to deliver the device directly to her, rather than following standard protocols. I think they shared a vision, Sarah suggested, not just about mathematics or navigation, but about how technology should serve humanity rather than threaten it. That ethical framework seems to have been as important to them as the technology itself. As Thomas settled in for the night, Sarah returned to the porch, contemplating the stars that had guided navigators for centuries before Eleanor's mathematical innovations made precision guidance possible. The same stars that Lieutenant Hayes had followed on his final flight to Oak Ridge Farm, carrying technology that would help end a war, but that Eleanor had recognized could also start new ones if misused. The cleared eastern forest now represented something profound to Sarah, not just expanded farmland or a historical discovery site, but a physical manifestation of Eleanor's philosophy that sometimes what's buried needs air. The trees had protected family secrets until the world was ready to receive them. Their removal had allowed truth to emerge when it could be properly understood and safeguarded. Sarah Thompson had begun the week as a reluctant farmer seeking practical solutions to agricultural challenges. She would continue as something far more complex, a guardian of dual legacy, cultivating both the fertile soil of Oak Ridge Farm and the ethical framework her grandmother had embedded within mathematical brilliance that had helped win a war while establishing principles for the peace that followed. The young woman who had once been eager to escape rural life for environmental science now recognized that her grandmother had been engaged in the most profound environmental stewardship of all, creating technology that could either harm or heal the world, and ensuring it would be governed by ethical principles that valued preservation alongside progress. Just as Eleanor had balanced her mathematical innovations with her commitment to the land that had both sustained and concealed her remarkable work. 3 weeks after the discovery that transformed Oak Ridge Farm from a simple agricultural enterprise into a site of historical significance, Sarah Thompson stood at the edge of the eastern field, watching new growth emerge where oak trees had stood for generations. Spring had fully arrived in Montana, bringing vibrant life to land recently exposed to sunlight for the first time in decades. Your grandmother would approve, Colonel Reynolds observed, joining Sarah in her morning inspection. The mathematician had remained at Oak Ridge as the official academic liaison for the Eleanor Thompson Mathematical Ethics Trust, helping bridge the worlds of classified military applications and public historical recognition. She understood the necessity of both clearing and cultivation, Sarah agreed, kneeling to examine the rich soil now prepared for planting. The land needs renewal, just as history needs reassessment. The weeks following the dramatic confrontation over Eleanor's technology had seen remarkable developments. The trust documentation Eleanor had prepared decades earlier had proven legally unassailable, creating a framework that balanced multiple competing interests while ensuring her ethical guidelines remain inseparable from her mathematical innovations. The first academic paper acknowledging your grandmother's contributions will be published next month, Colonel Reynolds reported, obviously with certain technical details classified, but establishing her rightful place in the historical record. And the technology itself, Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer through her position as principal trustee, being implemented exactly as Eleanor intended, with ethical constraints built directly into the algorithmic architecture. The Defense Department has officially recognized that the safeguards enhance rather than limit the technology's effectiveness. This vindication of Eleanor's integrated approach represented perhaps the most significant victory, rather than treating ethical considerations as external restrictions imposed on technology. The military and scientific communities had been forced to acknowledge that Eleanor's moral framework was mathematically embedded within her innovations, the two inseparable by design. Walking back toward the farmhouse, they passed the site where the P-47 had rested for over 7 decades. Now carefully excavated and restored to its original contours, the area had been designated as a small memorial garden, a place of reflection rather than agricultural production. The historical marker arrives tomorrow, Colonel Reynolds noted. The wording has been approved by both the Trust Committee and the military reviewers. The marker would acknowledge Lieutenant Richard Hayes's final mission and sacrifice without revealing classified details. While honoring Eleanor Thompson's dual contributions to agriculture and military technology, the deliberate balance between transparency and necessary security reflected Eleanor's own lifelong navigation between public farming and classified mathematics. At the farmhouse, Thomas Hayes was assisting with the cataloging of personal artifacts recovered from the underground workshop. His perspective as Richard Hayes' son had proved invaluable in understanding the human dimension of the historical narrative, complementing the technical assessment of Eleanor's mathematical innovations. "I found something remarkable," he called as Sarah entered a series of letters. "My father wrote these to your grandmother, but they were never sent, apparently carried in the aircraft but preserved separately from his official effects." The letters revealed the depth of connection between the pilot and the mathematician, a relationship founded on shared values as much as personal attraction. Richard Hayes had recognized in Eleanor Thompson not just brilliant intelligence, but moral clarity about how such intelligence should be applied. She saw the full circle. Thomas read from one letter, "From the mathematics of destruction to the algorithms of reconstruction, while others calculate merely to hit targets, Eleanor calculates to minimize innocent casualties, to preserve what must be rebuilt, to end the fighting more quickly with less suffering. Her equations contain more humanity than most philosophers' entire works." This perspective reinforced what had become increasingly clear through Eleanor's journals and technical documentation, that her ethical framework wasn't an afterthought, but integral to her mathematical approach. She had designed systems that accomplished military objectives while minimizing civilian impact, that balanced immediate tactical needs with long-term humanitarian considerations. "The Foundation is sending representatives next week," Colonel Reynolds reminded Sarah as they reviewed the ongoing implementation of the trust provisions. "Their grant could establish the educational program permanently." This initiative, perhaps more than any other aspect of Eleanor's legacy, had captured Sarah's passion. The Eleanor Thompson STEM ethics program would bring students from across the country to Oak Ridge Farm, using the historical narrative of the mathematician-farmer as a framework for exploring the inseparable relationship between technological advancement and ethical responsibility. "We'll host the first group in the barn," Sarah decided, envisioning the historic structure transformed into an educational space without sacrificing its agricultural authenticity. They should experience the same balance Eleanor maintained theoretical principles applied in practical contexts. By midday, the farm welcomed an unexpected visitor, General Sullivan, now accompanied by the director of the National Science Foundation. Their arrival without prior notice suggested developments beyond the established trust protocols. "Ms. Thompson," the general greeted her formally, "something has emerged that requires your immediate attention as trustee, a situation that Eleanor Thompson apparently anticipated decades ago. In the privacy of the farmhouse study," he explained the urgent development. 3 days ago, a research team at the Sentinel Technologies Advanced Computing Lab made a breakthrough in quantum computing that allows for unprecedented processing speed. Their first application attempt was reconstructing the original Aurora algorithms from fragmentary historical records. Sarah immediately grasped the implications. "They're trying to bypass my grandmother's ethical framework by reverse engineering her mathematical principles without the safeguards." "Precisely," the general confirmed. "However, their implementation failed catastrophically, causing system-wide failures that damaged equipment worth millions. Their algorithms appeared mathematically sound but collapsed under actual application stress." The National Science Foundation director elaborated, "Upon reviewing their approach, our specialists identified what appears to be a deliberate mathematical trap embedded in the fragmentary records, an elegant recursive loop that activates only when the algorithms are implemented without certain ethical constraint parameters." Sarah smiled in quiet appreciation of her grandmother's foresight. She created a mathematical immune system that rejects applications attempting to separate the technology from its ethical framework. "More than that," the general added with evident respect, "she apparently encoded a message within the failure sequence. When properly analyzed, the error pattern spells out in mathematical symbols, translatable to English, technology without conscience destroys itself." This revelation transformed what might have been a contentious confrontation into an opportunity for deeper collaboration. The Sentinel Technologies Lab, having experienced the consequences of attempting to circumvent Eleanor's integrated approach, now sought legitimate access through the trust framework she had established. They're requesting permission to study the complete algorithms. Ethical constraints included, under trust supervision, the general explained. This represents exactly the scenario Eleanor designed her trust to address, ensuring advanced applications of her work would maintain the moral framework she considered essential. As trustee, Sarah had authority to approve or deny such access. The decision required balancing advancement with protection. Innovation with responsibility, precisely the equilibrium Eleanor had maintained throughout her remarkable career. I'll approve conditional access, Sarah decided after careful consideration, with trust representatives monitoring implementation and mandatory integration of the ethical parameters. No component of the technology can be extracted or implemented separately. This decision set in motion a new phase of Eleanor Thompson's legacy, one that would influence cutting-edge quantum computing applications, while ensuring they remain governed by human-centered ethical considerations. The mathematics developed for wartime navigation would help guide humanity through the uncharted territories of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. Late afternoon brought additional visitors to Oak Ridge Farm, representatives from the Smithsonian Institution, interested in creating an exhibition about civilian contributions to military technology during World War II. With Eleanor Thompson's story as a centerpiece, we envision an installation that captures the duality of her life, the curator explained. Walking the property with Sarah, the agricultural implements alongside mathematical tools, farming journals beside technical calculations, showing how she maintained both identities while ensuring each informed the other. This public recognition represented something Eleanor herself had never sought, but which Sarah now recognized as essential for inspiring future generations. The story of a farmer mathematician who embedded ethical considerations directly into technological innovation offered a powerful model for addressing contemporary challenges. The exhibition should emphasize that her ethical framework wasn't imposed externally, but integrated mathematically. Sarah insisted, that's the most important lesson for today's scientists and engineers. Moral considerations aren't limitations on technology, but essential components of truly advanced systems. As evening approached, Sarah hosted a gathering on the farmhouse porch, bringing together the various individuals now connected through Eleanor's legacy: Colonel Reynolds, Thomas Hayes, General Sullivan, and representatives from the academic, military, and historical preservation communities. 3 weeks ago, I was clearing trees to expand farmland, Sarah reflected, watching the sunset illuminate the partially transformed eastern field. I had no idea I was actually clearing space for truth to emerge, for history to be rewritten, and for my own understanding of purpose to be transformed. Thomas Hayes, who had decided to relocate temporarily to Montana to participate in documenting his father's connection to the Thompson legacy, offered his perspective. Our parents and grandparents lived in a time when certain contributions had to remain hidden for security reasons, but they created mechanisms ensuring the truth would eventually emerge when the world was ready to understand it properly. Colonel Reynolds added academic context. Eleanor Thompson represents a category of historical contributors we're only beginning to properly acknowledge, individuals whose work was deliberately obscured for security or social reasons, but whose innovations shaped technological development in profound ways. As darkness fell and stars appeared above Oak Ridge Farm, Sarah considered how differently she now viewed the property she had inherited. What had initially felt like a burden of responsibility, an obligation to maintain family land when she had planned a different career path, had revealed itself as something far more meaningful, a living connection to a legacy of balanced purpose. Eleanor understood something essential about innovation, General Sullivan observed, articulating what had become increasingly clear through study of her work. That technological advancement without ethical grounding becomes destructive not just morally, but functionally. Her mathematical safeguards weren't restrictions, but essential operating parameters. This principle had been dramatically demonstrated by the Sentinel Technologies Lab's failed attempts to implement the algorithms without their ethical components, resulting not in unrestricted capability, but in system collapse. Eleanor had encoded her moral framework so deeply into her mathematical innovations that they literally could not function when separated from their ethical foundations. The following morning brought a milestone in the unfolding story of Oak Ridge Farm's transformation. Construction crews arrived to begin converting the historic barn into the educational center that would host the Eleanor Thompson STEM ethics program while maintaining its authentic agricultural character. "We'll preserve the original structure completely," the historical architect explained, reviewing plans with Sarah. "The modifications focus on creating flexible learning spaces while honoring the barn's essential role in the farm's operation." This approach perfectly embodied Eleanor's own balanced perspective, recognizing that preservation and progress could coexist, that historical authenticity and contemporary purpose could strengthen rather than undermine each other. As workers began the careful renovation process, Sarah walked to the memorial garden being established at the crash site. There, landscapers were creating a contemplative space incorporating elements that symbolize both Eleanor's mathematical work and Richard Hayes's sacrifice patterns of plantings that subtly reflected the geometric principles underlying the Aurora algorithms. "We've incorporated native species that provide habitat for pollinators," the lead landscape designer explained. Knowing Sarah's environmental science background would appreciate this dimension, the garden will serve ecological purposes while honoring historical significance. This integration of multiple values within a single design decision reflected Eleanor's approach throughout her life, finding solutions that simultaneously address different dimensions of complex challenges rather than treating them as separate considerations. By midday, the official historical marker arrived for installation near the farm's entrance. The carefully crafted text acknowledged Eleanor Thompson as mathematician, farmer, an ethical innovator whose work transformed military navigation technology while establishing principles for the responsible application of scientific advancement. As the marker was secured in place, Sarah reflected on how this public acknowledgement represented just one facet of Eleanor's emerging legacy. Beyond historical recognition lay the ongoing implementation of her mathematical principles in contemporary technologies. The educational programs that would transmit her integrated approach to future generations, and the trust framework ensuring her ethical guidelines would govern applications she could never have imagined. Thomas Hayes joined Sarah as the installation crew departed, leaving them alone with the newly placed marker. "I've been thinking about what motivated them," he said quietly. "My father diverted from his mission, risking everything to deliver the technology directly to your grandmother rather than through military channels. He must have believed profoundly in her vision of how it should be governed. And she protected both his sacrifice and the technology by making the difficult decision to conceal the crash." Sarah added, "Not to hide the truth permanently, but to preserve it until it could emerge in the right context." This perspective had profound implications for Sarah's own decisions about the Eastern Field. While the crash site had been preserved as a memorial garden, the remaining cleared area presented an opportunity to implement sustainable agriculture practices informed by both Eleanor's traditional farming knowledge and contemporary environmental science. "I'm going to establish an experimental section," she decided, walking the boundaries of what had once been oak forest and would now become productive farmland. Applying regenerative agriculture principles that honor both the land's history and its future potential, this decision represented Sarah's own integration of seemingly separate aspects of her life, her environmental science training, her family's agricultural heritage, and the newly discovered legacy of balanced innovation that Eleanor had embodied. The Eastern Field would become not just productive farmland, but a living laboratory demonstrating how historical wisdom and contemporary science could work together. As afternoon brought increasing activity to Oak Ridge Farm military personnel continuing to document the underground bunker, construction crews beginning barn renovations, and agricultural specialists assessing soil conditions in the Eastern Field, Sarah retreated briefly to her grandmother's study, seeking quiet reflection amidst the transformation. Among Eleanor's personal effects recovered from the workshop, Sarah had discovered a small notebook. Unlike the formal journals and technical documentation, this contained more personal reflections, Eleanor's private thoughts about maintaining her dual identity, and the emotional weight of her wartime contributions. I calculate blast radiuses by day, one entry read, and measure rainfall by night. I track bomber formations across European skies while monitoring corn growth in Montana. Some would see contradiction in these dual roles, but I find essential harmony. Both require understanding natural patterns, respecting the principles that govern our world, and recognizing that human intervention must work with these patterns rather than against them. This integration of scientific precision with natural stewardship perfectly articulated what had become increasingly clear through Eleanor's technical documentation, that her ethical framework wasn't imposed artificially on her mathematics, but emerged organically from her understanding of how complex systems function most effectively. A knock at the study door announced Colonel Reynolds, who entered with news from Washington. The classified review has been completed. He reported, Eleanor Thompson will receive posthumous recognition with the Presidential Medal of Freedom in a ceremony next month. As trustee, you'll accept on her behalf. This highest civilian honor represented formal acknowledgement of Eleanor's contributions at the national level, recognition, delayed by decades of necessary security classification but now possible through the trust framework she had established. There's something else, Colonel Reynolds continued. The investigation into Sentinel Technologies' attempts to access the technology has revealed that they obtained fragments of the original algorithms through questionable channels during the Cold War. Their failed attempts to implement these fragments led them to monitor properties connected to Project Aurora personnel, including Oak Ridge Farm. This explained the rapid corporate response to Sarah's discovery. Sentinel Technologies had been watching the property for decades, waiting for any indication that Eleanor's complete work might surface. They monitored my social media, Sarah realized. When I posted about clearing the eastern forest, they recognized the potential significance immediately. Their surveillance actually accelerated the protection of Eleanor's legacy, Colonel Reynolds observed. By moving so aggressively to claim the technology, they triggered the trust provisions she had established, ensuring proper oversight rather than exploitation. This ironic outcome reflected Eleanor's remarkable foresight. She had anticipated not just that her work would eventually resurface, but that competing interests would attempt to separate its technical brilliance from its ethical framework. Her trust provisions had been designed precisely to address this scenario, ensuring that any implementation of her mathematics would maintain the moral constraints she considered essential. As evening settled over Oak Ridge Farm, Sarah walked the perimeter of her property, seeing it with new awareness of its multidimensional significance. Beyond its agricultural productivity and natural beauty lay layers of historical importance, technological innovation, and ethical philosophy, all interconnected through Eleanor Thompson's remarkable life and legacy. The partially cleared eastern field represented this integration perfectly, a space where forest had concealed truth for decades, now transformed into an area that would honor the past while creating new productive potential. Preserving historical significance while generating sustainable harvests. Returning to the farmhouse as twilight deepened, Sarah found Thomas Hayes examining family photographs in the kitchen, including several newly discovered images of Eleanor and Richard together during his visits to the farm. They were visionaries in different ways, he reflected, studying the expressions of the young mathematician and pilot captured in black and white. My father understood that precision bombing could actually be more humane than conventional warfare if guided by the right principles. Your grandmother created the mathematical framework that made those principles operational rather than merely theoretical. This practical implementation of ethical considerations, translating moral philosophy into functional algorithms, represented Eleanor's most profound contribution. She had demonstrated that technology functions most effectively when human values are integrated directly into its operational architecture rather than imposed as external restrictions. As night fell completely over Oak Ridge Farm, Sarah sat on the porch where generations of Thompsons had contemplated the challenges of their respective eras. The property had been transformed in just 3 weeks from a struggling family farm to a multifaceted historical site. educational center, and living laboratory for sustainable agriculture informed by both traditional wisdom and cutting-edge science. The decisions that had led to this transformation began with Sarah's simple choice to clear neglected land for cultivation, an agricultural necessity that had unexpectedly unearthed historical significance with contemporary implications. The cleared trees had created space for buried truth to emerge, for long-concealed innovations to find appropriate application in a new century, and for Sarah herself to discover purpose that integrated her environmental science background with her family's remarkable legacy. In the distance, security lights still illuminated the crash site where Lieutenant Richard Hayes had made his final delivery of Eleanor's revolutionary technology. The aircraft and its contents had now been carefully preserved and documented, the human remains respectfully recovered for proper military honors, and the site itself transformed into a place of reflection rather than concealment. What had begun as a young farmer's practical decision to expand productive acreage had revealed itself as something far more profound, the final phase of Eleanor Thompson's remarkable foresight, ensuring her mathematical brilliance and ethical framework would emerge together when the world was ready to understand their inseparable relationship. The next morning, as construction teams continued work on the barn renovation, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Evelyn Chen, Chief Technology Officer of Sentinel Technologies, arrived alone and without corporate entourage, requesting a private conversation. Initially wary, Sarah agreed to meet in the farmhouse kitchen, a deliberately informal setting that emphasized the farm's agricultural identity rather than its newfound historical significance. Colonel Reynolds joined them at Sarah's request, a quiet reminder of the trust's protective oversight. "I'm here in an unofficial capacity," Dr. Chen began, her expression more thoughtful than confrontational. "What I've come to say isn't Sentinel's official position, but something I feel compelled to share personally." Sarah remained cautiously silent, allowing the scientist to continue. "I was the one who led the failed attempt to reconstruct Eleanor Thompson's algorithms," Dr. Chen admitted. "I've spent 20 years studying fragmentary records of Project Aurora, believing we could reverse engineer the mathematical principles without fully understanding the ethical constraints Eleanor built into them." She placed a small flash drive on the kitchen table. "This contains our complete research data on the implementation failure. The mathematical trap your grandmother designed is the most elegant safeguard I've ever encountered, not a simple password or encryption, but a fundamental principle woven throughout the system that makes the technology self-destruct when applied without ethical constraints." "Why are you sharing this?" Sarah asked directly. "Because I've come to believe Eleanor Thompson was right," Dr. Chen replied. "The catastrophic failure of our systems wasn't just a technical setback, it was a profound lesson. We approached the technology as pure mathematics, separable from moral considerations. The failure forced us to recognize that the ethical framework isn't an optional addition, but an essential component." This acknowledgement from a leading technologist represented a significant validation of Eleanor's approach recognition, not just of her mathematical brilliance, but of her ethical foresight. "Sentinel's board still believes the technology can be monetized," Dr. Chen continued with transparent honesty. "They'll continue pursuing legal channels to gain access. But I wanted you to know that many of us within the research division have been transformed by this experience. We're beginning to understand what Eleanor Thompson recognized decades ago, that truly advanced technology must incorporate human values at its foundational level." This unexpected ally from within the corporate structure that had seemed most threatening to Eleanor's legacy offered a new pathway for collaboration, one that honored the trust's ethical requirements while allowing for continued innovation. "The trust framework my grandmother established doesn't prevent technological advancement," Sarah observed. "It ensures that advancement proceeds with integrated ethical considerations. If Sentinel is willing to work within those parameters, there could be common ground." Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to propose exactly that: a research partnership that respects the trust conditions, while allowing us to explore applications Eleanor Thompson couldn't have imagined in her time." Colonel Reynolds, who had remained silent during the exchange, offered his perspective. The trust was designed to be adaptive while maintaining core principles. Eleanor anticipated that new applications would emerge, which is why she focused on embedding fundamental ethical constraints rather than specific technological limitations. By midday, this unexpected development had led to preliminary discussions of a potential research collaboration, one that would maintain the trust's authority while allowing carefully monitored exploration of Eleanor's mathematics in contemporary contexts. The proposed partnership would include strict oversight from the Trust Committee, ensuring that Eleanor's ethical safeguards remained intact in any implementation, as Dr. Chen departed with a tentative framework for future cooperation. Sarah felt a deepening appreciation for her grandmother's wisdom. Eleanor hadn't simply protected her work from misuse. She had created mechanisms that would eventually transform how future generations approach technological development itself. The following week brought the arrival of the first student group for the Eleanor Thompson STEM Ethics program. 20 undergraduate engineering and mathematics students from universities across the country gathered in the partially renovated barn, which now housed educational spaces while maintaining its agricultural character. Sarah welcomed them to Oak Ridge Farm. Standing beside the navigation device display a non-functional replica created for educational purposes. With the actual technology secured in a government facility under trust supervision, Eleanor Thompson wasn't just a brilliant mathematician who happened to have ethical concerns. Sarah explained to the assembled students, she developed a fundamentally new approach to technology, one where moral considerations aren't imposed after development but integrated into the mathematical architecture itself. As the students engaged with interactive displays highlighting Eleanor's dual contributions to agriculture and military technology, Sarah observed their growing recognition of how this historical narrative related to their own future work in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and other emerging fields. Your grandmother essentially invented ethical algorithms before anyone even conceived of such a thing. One doctoral candidate in computer science remarked, she was embedding moral frameworks into computational systems decades before ethics became a consideration in computer science. This historical perspective offered contemporary students a powerful model for their own innovations, demonstrating that technological advancement didn't require separating scientific progress from human values, but could integrate them as mutually reinforcing elements. Later that evening, after the students had departed for their accommodations in nearby Madison, Sarah sat with Thomas Hayes on the farmhouse porch, watching fireflies emerge over the eastern field where new crops were beginning to sprout. My father never lived to see how his final mission would eventually be understood, Thomas reflected. But I think he would be pleased to know that the technology he carried didn't just help end one war. It's now helping create a framework for how humanity approaches its most powerful innovations. They were both ahead of their time, Sarah agreed, not just in their mathematics but in their understanding of technology's relationship to human values. This multi-generational perspective brought deeper meaning to the transformations occurring at Oak Ridge Farm. The agricultural enterprise continued, fields were planted, livestock tended, equipment maintained, but these traditional farming activities now existed alongside educational programs, historical preservation, and cutting-edge research applications, all guided by Eleanor Thompson's integrated approach to knowledge and ethics. As the month progressed, preparations intensified for the Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony. Sarah worked with military historians to finalize the public narrative of Eleanor's contributions, carefully balancing historical accuracy with necessary security considerations. The official citation would acknowledge Eleanor's dual role as mathematician and farmer, recognizing her as one of the unsung heroines whose civilian expertise had significantly influenced military outcomes. On the evening before her departure for Washington, Sarah visited the memorial garden at the crash site, now complete with native plantings arranged in subtle patterns, reflecting the mathematical principles Eleanor had pioneered. The simple stone marker acknowledged both Eleanor Thompson and Richard Hayes, their names linked by the shared vision that had brought them together and ultimately cost Richard his life. I think I understand now. Grandma, Sarah said quietly to the evening air. You weren't just protecting secrets, you were preserving a particular approach to knowledge, one that refuses to separate what we can do from what we should do. The soft Montana twilight settled over Oak Ridge Farm as Sarah made her final preparations for the journey to Washington. In the eastern field, new crops grew where ancient oaks had stood for generations, their removal revealing not just buried history, but new possibilities. The farm had been transformed, yet remained true to its essence, just as Eleanor had maintained her identity as a farmer while engaging with the most advanced mathematics of her era. Sarah Thompson had cleared dead trees expecting to expand productive acreage. Instead, she had uncovered a legacy that would shape the responsible application of technology for generations to come, a discovery that transformed not just Oak Ridge Farm, but our understanding of how innovation achieves its greatest potential when guided by an unwavering moral compass and a deep connection to the land we all share. As Sarah locked the farmhouse door behind her, preparing to represent her grandmother at the highest levels of national recognition, she carried with her the key lessons of Eleanor's remarkable life that the most advanced technology incorporates rather than bypasses human values. That protection sometimes requires concealment until the right moment for revelation, and that seemingly separate domains of knowledge, farming and mathematics, ethics and algorithms, history and innovation achieve their greatest potential not in isolation, but in careful, conscious integration. The eastern field, now planted with experimental, sustainable crops, stood as living testimony to Eleanor Thompson's integrated vision, a space where truth had been buried for decades, waiting for the right moment to emerge into the light of a new century that might finally be ready to understand the inseparable relationship between technological power and ethical responsibility.